Hello, welcome to the Everything is Black and White podcast. It's time for the Monday show. I'm Andrew Musgrove, and today I'm joined by our Newcastle United writer, Sean McCormick, as we look at the burning questions following Newcastle United's 3-2 defeat to Everton. Newcastle United put in another lacklustre performance at home, making it their fifth defeat in the last 7 games in the Premier League and stretching their winless run at home to just under 2 months. For some, this performance against Everton was a double blow, one of the worst of the season, but also a defeat that all but ended their Champions League hopes of qualification. As always, a big thanks to our sponsors, NordVPN and Saily, 2 products that will enhance your travel abroad. NordVPN providing the safety and security you need while browsing, and Saily giving you that affordable eSIM and network coverage. You can get discounts by hitting the link in the podcast description box. Let's get on with the show. Sean, welcome back. How are you keeping? You well?
Yeah, all good. Bit of paternity leave like yourself, Andrew, so it's nice to talk about Newcastle United. I felt that this could be a podcast for sleep-deprived dads, but instead I was back at the game on Saturday, my first shift back in 3 weeks. The Everton game, obviously nice to be back on the beat, but then the game happened, and I think it was up there for one of the worst performances I've seen from Newcastle certainly this season. I wasn't at the Brentford game. That looked pretty bad on the TV, but it just felt on Saturday that they were just really struggling to create anything of real note. I thought that a number of players struggled. I thought that the team selection was all wrong. And it all just culminated into a pretty depressing day. They almost got something from it in the end, of course, scoring twice, and then John Pickford made that unbelievable save from Sandro Tonali in stoppage time. But in truth, I don't think Newcastle would have deserved that point that they would have got through that Tonali goal. And I feel like this has to be a real kick up the backside ahead of what is such an important run of fixtures across the next 3 weeks.
Yeah, a lot of talk about, but it is like someone up at Newcastle United went, right, Sean and you're coming back to work. We've won a couple of games. Let's give them something to complain and moan about, because it just was not good at all. And I mentioned there in the introduction, it did feel like a huge game for Newcastle United in terms of their European hopes. And I'll get your answer on whether that kind of kills off the chances of Champions League qualification later in the show. But would it be fair to say, Sean, right from the word go, right from the moment the team news dropped on Saturday, that it just felt like one of those days? 6 changes made, Joelinton starting out on the left, Voldemort starting in midfield, Anthony Gordon starting up top. For many, before a game was even kicked, they were kind of fearing the worst.
I think it's never a good thing when the team news drops and you're not actually sure where players have actually played in the team. So when the team news dropped on Saturday, obviously Eddie Howe went with Anthony Gordon up front, Nick Voldemort in midfield, Julian on the left wing. But obviously there was quite a bit of discussion in the press room. Does that mean is Nick Voldemort back up front? Does that mean Anthony Gordon's back in the wing? Does that mean Anthony Gordon's up front, Voldemar's midfield, and it's Joelinton on the left, which is obviously what it turned out to be. So there was also some shouts that Jacob Ramsey could be on the left, which is obviously where he played quite a bit for Aston Villa. Obviously, the way it turned out, it just felt like square pegs and round holes. Now, I know Nick Voldemort has done a job in midfield when Newcastle have needed it, when they've had, the likes of Bruno out injured, Lewis Miley out injured, Jacob Ramsey's missed a couple of games. But when there's the options there, I mean, Joe Willock was on the bench on Saturday as well. Joelinton started on the left wing, so they had the midfield numbers there to play 3 actual midfielders. I just think the Voldemort midfield experiment, while it probably needed to happen, just hasn't worked. And I think on Saturday, it was exposed against an Everton team who were physical, who pressed Newcastle from the off. And I felt sorry for Voldemort because I was watching him just thinking he didn't look like a player who knew the position. He didn't know when to press. He didn't know what position he needed to be in defensively. Got caught in possession a couple of times. And I felt like it was no coincidence when Newcastle got the equaliser. It was just after Eddie Howe made the changes where he reverted all 3 of those players back to their natural positions. Voldemort then got hooked after 55 minutes, and obviously there's been quite a bit of talk on social media and some criticism. I think Alan Shearer talked about his numbers being nowhere near good enough, and you can't disagree with that. I do feel sorry for him because I think there's a lot of mitigating factors in that, and I think that's obviously something we're going to discuss in this podcast.
Well, let's stick with Voldemort because I've got the quotes from Alan Shearer, and I know they've provoked a lot of debates online. Do you think the reason Voldemort is being trialled in a midfield role, is it because they feel like they need to use him because they spend so much money on him and it's not worked up top? Do you think it's because there's a lack of creativity in the middle of the park with Bruno out injured? Why are they persistent with trying Voldemort in a position which I think everyone probably agrees he's just not very good at?
If I'm honest, I feel like it's become quite apparent that if you look at the way Newcastle have been successful over the last 3 years of the Eddie Howe reign, it's through a front line who are absolutely relentless in the way that they press. Nick Voldemort isn't that type of player. I feel like if you look at how when Voldemort first came into the club and when he was getting success, it was when he's doing things off instinct. Look at some of the goals he scored. I mean, the flick at Brighton, the penalty against Nottingham Forest, the lob against Everton, the flick against Union SG in the Champions League as well. Some brilliant goals. But the criticism was always he was too deep. He was trying to play more as number 10 than a number 9. There was times where he wasn't in the positions to get on the end of crosses. You look at, for example, when Jacob Murphy plays, his instinct is always touch, have a cross in the box. And Voldemort 9 times out of 10 wasn't in the position to attack those crosses. I think the irony, if you look at it, is obviously we know the situation this summer where when you Alexander Isak was angling for a move, and Newcastle tried to sign forwards of that ilk who would have suited the style that they played. So if you look at the players they tried to sign, João Pedro, Hugh Ekitike, which we've seen against Newcastle on a couple of occasions now, would have been absolutely perfect. Benjamin Sesko's coming into his own now, which obviously Newcastle may feel the full effect of on Wednesday when they play Manchester United. But I mean, if you look at his 2 goals this week, the counter-attacking goal against Everton, which he took brilliantly, and then the bullet header yesterday, it's hard not to sort of look elsewhere and think that's the type of striker Newcastle really needed. And then obviously with the way that the Isak saga panned out and the way that those players didn't come to Newcastle in the end, they were sort of backed into a corner. The Voldemort opportunity presented itself. And while I think he's an excellent player, I don't think that's in doubt. I just don't think he suits the way Newcastle play. Now, you've got 2 options there. You either sort of cut your losses and suggest that he just doesn't fit the way you play, or you try and find a way to fit him into your system. And I think that in Europe, the Union game always sticks out of my mind of the way he came and dropped deep, and then the spaces that Anthony Gordon and Anthony Elanga exploited in behind. Anthony Gordon made the point, didn't he, that the teams in Europe in the Champions League come to play and play of a higher line, and that sort of suits Newcastle's game. When teams come to play them, they can pick them off. The problem is in the Premier League, it's become so rigid and so organised that the spaces just aren't there. And I think that's the sort of team where Voldemort thrives in, is where you can pick up those spaces and where the wingers can get in behind. If that's not happening against teams with low blocks, then you're sort of losing his sort of USP. And if you look at Stuttgart, he played up front in a 2. We sort of trialled that against Bournemouth in the FA Cup, where he sort of played in a 10 rule behind Visser, and it worked to some degree, but then they started losing a bit defensively as well. It's interesting to see what happens, because I think there's a player there. I think criticism to say that he's nowhere near good enough is way over the top, because he's Germany's number 9 for a reason. And interestingly, Julian Nagelsmann has come out over the weekend and thrown his support behind Voldemort and said that he retains his full trust to be Germany's number 9. The problem is Newcastle haven't found a way to use him properly. I don't think, and I think.
Does that fall on Eddie Howe? Does he deserve criticism for not adapting? Do we give him a little bit of leeway because we know that he's very meticulous, and to adapt and to change the formation and style, you need time on the training ground. He's not got that because of playing so many competitions. What is the solution? Does Eddie Howe just need to kind of bite the bullet and actually go full on adaptation to suit Voldemort? And I suppose the question after that is Voldemort good enough? Is he going to be Newcastle United's future to justify that happening?
I mean, he's a young forward and he scored 10 goals. So I think you've got to sort of keep the faith with him that he can come good. It's just whether or not Newcastle adapt to him or he needs to adapt to Newcastle. Now, as you say there, the lack of training time this season has been a big factor in terms of a lot of the signings being able to adapt. I think you're just starting to see Jacob Ramsey now, for example, really sort of getting into the swing of being a Newcastle player. Voldemort has shown signs he can do it. I think one of the bigger issues actually is the fact that they've signed a Premier League oven-ready forward in Johan Visser, who just looks absolutely nowhere near it as well. And I think that is a problem because that's sort of piling the pressure on more on Voldemort to sort of. If you look at, I think Voldemort has played 45 times this season already, which, considering we're only in March, is pretty mental workload, and he's a young forward who's sort of been, flogged to some extent. Yeah, like he's played a lot of football, and there's a lot of pressure on him. And I think to begin with, he dealt with that. I think he needs support in terms of, Vissa hasn't come in and done it. Now, obviously the extenuating circumstances of the injury in the summer, I think it would have played out very differently if Vissa didn't get injured on international duty DR Congo. I think Vissa would have been sort of the player who played the Premier League games, and Voldemort got eased in that way. And I think you would have probably seen a bit like what Sesko's doing now at Man United, where it took him a bit of time, but he started scoring the goals. Maybe that would have benefited Voldemort. It's probably backfired on that he started so well, and now when he's needing the support, it isn't really there. And yeah, it's just it's a frustrating one. It's a difficult one to answer, I think, because I think the expectation was Vissa would be the sort of more like for Isak, and we haven't really seen that yet. He hasn't really hit the ground running, doesn't look fit, doesn't look sharp, doesn't look like he's firing. I think that is a big factor as well, which would help Armada.
The change to play to his strengths, when we talk about it, some see it as a huge change, a total tactical change, but I don't actually think it's necessarily that big. I think all you need to do is to get the wingers to play a bit more narrow, and I get that is to some actually a big change, because Harvey Barnes, Jacob Murphy, Anthony Gordon, they're best when they're right on the touchline and they're breathing down the necks of the fullbacks. But actually, I think if you play those three closer together in a bit more of a central kind of in the central area, I think that will benefit Voldemort, because he's not isolated. You can have the speed of Gordon and Barnes, or Gordon and Murphy running on beyond him, as we've seen a couple of times. I think against Everton, actually, at Goodison Park, we saw it as well. And Langer played well that day, Voldemort played well that day. Just haven't seen it enough. But I don't necessarily think it's a massive tweak to say, well, let's play a little bit now. And look, we're at this stage of the season where, was it 10 games left? Yeah. Let's be honest, Champions League football looks done and dusted. If they lose on Wednesday to Manchester United, you can probably write off anything European at all. Is it maybe now a time to maybe experiment a little bit and say, yeah, let's play the wingers a little bit closer to Voldemort, keep him up top, and just see what happens?
I think, well, they need to change something. They need to have some sort of fresh impetus in the team. It's as simple as that. And I think there is a criticism that the wingers do play far too wide for Newcastle sometimes, and I don't think I'm sort of labouring the point where it does look a bit one-dimensional a lot of the time when you look at the way they try to break down teams. And again, I've probably made the point on the podcast before that they probably need the training ground time to sort that out. And unfortunately, if Newcastle want to compete across the 4 competitions like they have done this season, that just isn't forthcoming. And it comes back, I think, to, you don't want to harp on about it too much, but the summer recruitment and how the fact that Voldemort and Vissa both arrived in the last weekend of the transfer window when there was no time on the training ground, because once September hit, that's when the Champions League started, that's when the Carabao Cup started taking up a notch. Obviously, the FA Cup's come in January as well, which Newcastle have obviously progressed in and got a big game in that competition on Saturday to look forward to as well. I think the summer is going to be big for Voldemort and his future, and how Newcastle sort of adapt to it. Does he adapt to Newcastle? Does Newcastle adapt to him? And I just think that, because things have gone badly in the Premier League, the reaction is understandably strong, because this Newcastle team shouldn't be bottom half of the Premier League table. It's as simple as that. And the performance haven't been good enough this season, and there's quite a few players who are copping the flak for that. And
do you think it's easy to criticise Voldemort, though? And we've seen a lot of it over this weekend from big names on social media as well, who've really gone in on Nick Voldemort, which I think's unfair. He's a young lad moving to a new league, moving to a new city, a new country, with that weight of that price tag, playing in a squad which has really lost its mojo, which is really struggling to find its rhythm, and yet he seems, for many, to be the one to jump on. And I don't think that's fair. I don't think that helps anyone. Is it fair? How do you look at it?
I think it's fair to a point. I think if you'll be very careful how you sort of attack the way that you criticise him, I think, because, as you say, it's still his first season. He's still a young forward, and he's played a lot of football. And I think he's probably played too much football, and you're starting to see the effect of that now. I think we always recognised and understood there'd be a blip in a young forward coming into England in his first season, and because he started so well, I think it raised the expectation levels quite a bit. There's experienced Premier League players in the Newcastle squad, big players who haven't performed anywhere near the levels this season, who warrant just as much criticism, if not more criticism, than Nick Voltemada does. I do think he would benefit from a little break out the side. The problem is does Johan Visser come in and score the goals? Is Anthony Gordon the answer up front in the Premier League? He's done well in the Champions League games, absolutely no doubt about it, but we haven't seen it up front in the Premier League yet, in my opinion. I don't know if you would agree with that.
I don't think we've seen it at all. and I don't think we ever will. There's something about, I think it goes back to what you said when you quoted Gordon earlier in the show. I think the way European teams play in the Champions League suits his style up top. In the Premier League, it just doesn't work. And there was various accusations thrown at Gordon this weekend about his performance against Everton, which again, maybe just, maybe a little bit unjustified, depending on where you sit. But yeah, I agree. You need to take Voldemort out of the firing line, but with us not fit, he's not going to gamble on Sean Neve despite his exploits in the youth ranks. So I don't know what the solution is. You got a magic sponge for you, Almusa?
Well, that's it, isn't it? It's like this. If there was an easy solution, I think it would be a lot easier to take Voldemort out of the firing line. As much as he's struggled this year, of course, it can so easily turn as well. It only takes a couple of goals, and as we've seen, I mentioned Benjamin Sesko before that, but I mean, if you look at how Voldemort sort of went in that run at the start of the season, it only takes one moment to sort of rekindle the confidence. I think what you find is Eddie Howe, in an ideal world, would want his front three being fluid and pressing, and I think that's why Anthony Gordon's playing at the minute, because he's the player who can sort of lead that press in the way that Voldemort can't. But it's also quite plain to see that Eddie Howe's a big fan of Nick Voldemort. Every time he's asked about Nick Voldemort, he's always been gushing in his praise for the way that he's fitted into the team, the way that he takes on information, the way that he's a good character around the place, that he's got a good sense of humour. It's undoubted that he's struggling at the moment, and Howe was asked about it on Saturday, the fact that, you know, he started in midfield, he struggled, he then went up front, didn't really make an impact. But he also said that they didn't really get enough balls into him as well. And I think collectively in the Premier League, for whatever reason, Newcastle are struggling this season. And it's not just down to Nick Voldemort, it's down to a lot of things. They're not creative enough. If you look at the defensive side of things, actually, I hate using XG too extensively, but the XG in terms of goals against Newcastle, they've got one of the best statistical records in the league, yet they've kept 2 clean sheets since the first 7 games. And it's just individual errors after individual errors that's costing them so badly at the back. And when they were struggling at the other end, that defensive stability that they've sort of prided themselves on across the last 3 years hasn't been there. Now, that's not a structural issue, because the stats would suggest that they're still performing well as a unit. What it would suggest is that look at Saturday, for example, the timing of the goals as well. Like, they equalise for Jacob Ramsey, and then Nick Pope makes a horrendous error. I've defended Pope at times this season. I still think he's the better option than Aaron Ramsdale, but clearly Newcastle need a better goalkeeper in the summer. He's been brilliant across 3 years before that, but this season the mistakes have just become too frequent, and the way he gifted that goal was poor on Saturday. Gordon lost the ball when Jacob Murphy equalised to make it 2-2. At that point, when Jacob Murphy equalises so late in the game, the crowd's up for it. It's a massive chance for Newcastle to kick on and get the win. And actually, if they do win their 8th, and this podcast is a lot happier because they're back in the European places, and all of a sudden things are looking up, and they've still got Brentford in the sights. The way that it's transpired is that the individual mistakes cost them again. They didn't create enough going forward, and that's been the story of the season. The creativity isn't there. Individual mistakes have cost them at the other end, and that is why Newcastle find themselves in the bottom half of the table. And all of a sudden, this Man United game Wednesday, to me, feels like the last chance saloon in terms of the Premier League, because we were having a discussion in the office before, Andrew, in terms of, I feel like we've all sort of sleepwalked into the fact that, well, they're 4 points off 4th, so that could turn, and then that turns to 5th, and that's the Champions League, so that's fine, because it's looking like the English team are going to get 5th place. 5th place in the Champions League that they did last season. It then goes down to 7th, and think we're not getting Europa League, we're 4 points off Brentford. And then after the defeat of the weekend, they're now 4 points off Everton. And it's, if they don't turn around quickly, not only not going to get European football, they might not even finish in the top half. And that just isn't good enough. Like, I know that they've had a lot of competitions to contend with. We've talked about the recruitment not necessarily being as good as it could have been in the summer. That's affected the squad depth. The training ground time isn't there. The injuries are starting to rack up because they're playing so much football. These are all mitigating factors that you've got to contend with. But the bottom line is the Premier League form hasn't been good enough. And unless that changes, we're now in the last 10 games of the season. We can't just keep saying, well, if they do this, they do that. It's got to start now. And the Man United game, to me, feels like a huge opportunity if they can, because it's always a big game when Man United come to St James's Park. There's always a fervent atmosphere because of the history between the two clubs. But I also fear to lose that game and then heading into not only does that ruin the sort of Premier League momentum, because they're already 4 points off 8. If they lose that game, the likelihood is that lead's going to stretch, and all of a sudden you've got 9 games to claw that back, and I just don't see how they're going to do that. But also, you're then going to the FA Cup and Champions League, which then those two competitions are where the season live and die on the back of 2 really poor defeats. So I don't think we can underestimate how important Wednesday is. I think it's got to be a season turn, and if it's not, I fear for what that means, not only for the Premier League, but for the FA Cup and the Champions League as well.
And then, of course, Sunderland on the horizon as well. I want to talk about the goals in a moment. I mentioned Alan Shearer's quote. He's given his backing to Voldemort. He says, I think there was a player in there, but it's a player who is really struggling. So we'll take the first part of that quote as something to work on. Interestingly, he said that he thought Newcastle were a bit of a mess, particularly in the first half hour when Joe was on the left, Voldemort in the centre midfield, and Gordon up front. And then he changed it and Voldemort went up top. I mean, look, if you make them substitutions with 30 minutes on the clock, then it's fair to say you probably got it wrong from the off, right?
Yeah, he did. And I think obviously there's been a lot of criticism of Eddie Howe this season. A lot of it's warranted, a lot of it's unwarranted. And I think that regardless of what happens the rest of the season, I think he's earned a summer with the new regime, with the CEO and the sporting director, to sort of give it another go in the summer and then sort of use it as a rebuild's probably a bit strong, but like a fresh start, a sort of a reboot maybe rather than a rebuild. I think he's earned that right, but I think that the Premier League form, where the bread and butter is really concerning. And I think at the weekend, this is probably not the first time, but I think it's a definite time where you look at Eddie Howe's team selection and categorically got it wrong. I think, as we said before, Voldemort in midfield, the experiment was worth trying. I think it was a decent solution when there was injuries in there. When you've got the personnel to play the midfield, I don't understand why that happened on Saturday. By all means, if you think Anthony Gordon's the best option up front, do that, but then don't try and shoehorn Voldemort into the team. And then if you are going to play Anthony Gordon up front, I then didn't understand why Joe didn't play on the left. Maybe it was to counteract the height, because I think Jake O'Brien was playing right back for Everton at the weekend. Huge centre half. I mean, it was like watching Stoke really, in terms of when they used to play like 4 centre halves at the back. Jake O'Brien, a big unit, and I think maybe that was the thinking. But then I don't know if it was because Joe Linton was then having to sort of link up with Voldemort in midfield, and it was just all a bit disjointed. But he looked a bit lost on the left. Where, to be fair to him, when he's played there in other games, he hasn't looked that way. But it didn't work. And to be fair to Howe and Tyndall, they recognised that. I think Graham Jones and Sam Weatherston were in the press box, as they always are, for the first half. And about 25 minutes in, they sort of rushed down to the touchline to pass on their observations, and quickly the team changed. And I think I said it before, it was no coincidence that when that did happen, Newcastle scored. Joe Linton was involved in it in terms of being in the midfield. Tonali, brilliant passing to Ramsey. Obviously, it was a deflection that took past Jordan Pickford. But positive thing for me in that sense was that my criticism of Jacob Ramsey this season is that he's so good until he gets to the edge of the box, and it's almost like he gets a nosebleed. It's whether the confidence wasn't there to take a shot or to play that sort of killer final pass. But we're starting to see more of that in recent weeks. Obviously, scored against Tottenham, scored at the weekend. Bizarre circumstances in which he came off. He obviously was sick on the pitch. Eddie Howe said after the game that it wasn't an issue that anyone was aware of until half time. So obviously that's just come on out of the blue. Hopefully he's fit for Wednesday, because I think he's been a real positive in a real tough period. He offers Newcastle a lot of control. He's very tidy in possession. He's starting to do the bit at the other end of the pitch now, which is what I think convinced them to sign him with Aston Villa in the first place. The fact that he's a goal scorer midfielder. So he's a real positive to sort of hang. If you're looking for any positives to hang your hat on, I think that is one. But yeah, as we said, when there's confusion about team selection, when you see the team come out, it's never a good thing. And then when you see the way it plays out, thankfully they changed it and they recognised it, but it was something they got wrong at the weekend.
Yeah, it was a big blow to see Ramsey go off because he looked like the one that could really change. But I thought Joe Linton actually when he got switched, it's not a very high bar given what happened on Saturday, but I actually thought Joe Linton looked quite threatening, and he was looking to create. Obviously, he's had his input in some of the goals as well. Just on the goals that Newcastle United conceded, and you mentioned there the individual errors. I mean, the first goal in particular has really wound me up. I think all three are totally avoidable, by the way. But Branthwaite gets the goal after 19 minutes, and I love Sandro Tonali. I've said on the podcast, I think he's the best midfielder I've seen at Newcastle United. He's absolute quality, and I stand by that despite the last few months of poor form. But for the love of God, someone needs to get into him and tell him that he needs to do his own job in his own box, because for far too many times this season, Tonali's not followed the man, or he's been too easily bypassed as the ball's coming from a cross or a corner, and Newcastle United have conceded. I think he gets away with it because of what he does going forward, and at the moment that's based on a bit of memory rather than seeing it in the present. But I do think if that was another player, there'd be a lot more stick for him. But he needs to be tighter to Branthwaite. He doesn't have to do too much at all, really, to get the better of Tonali. He just wants it more. He's got more desire, more hunger. He's just quicker off the block to get his head on the ball. It's really poor from Tonali. And I've said this several times this season. He needs to be better in the box.
It's interesting. To me, it felt like it was something that Everton obviously identified before the game, because if you look at the way that the set piece plays out, Tonali switches off for a split second and Branthwaite's away from him. That's poor. And you look back at the way the delivery comes in, though. I can't remember who the Everton player was who sort of looks to come short, and Joe Linton kind of gets stuck in that no man's land in the front post as well, where he sort of doesn't know how to follow him. Kind of does, then backtracks, but then it creates that gap for Branthwaite to then attack. Tonali then switches off, and it's a brilliant header from Branthwaite, to be fair to him. At the time, I thought it was really, really soft. I still do think it's soft, but you can't deny the quality of the header. And it's another example, I think, of... I don't want to go on too much of a rant about how football's becoming a set-piece game, but I was watching the Arsenal-Chelsea game yesterday. I don't know if you did as well, but all three goals come from corners, and I appreciate it's always been a sort of big thing for teams to utilise, but it almost feels like the long throw-in and the corners, it's becoming such a long ball, set-piece dominated game, and perhaps the criticism of Newcastle, I would say, is that they haven't adapted to it, and maybe that's why they've lost a lot of points and are in the position they are in the Premier League, because it's not the first time they've conceded from a set piece soft in a soft manner. You can look back to the Brentford long throw in away from home. That always sticks in my mind. There's obviously countless other examples as well where they haven't been good enough at defending set pieces, and Eddie Howe's spoken about that at length across the season. Tonali didn't do good enough. I think Joe Linton got stuck in no man's land, and clearly Everton had seen something before the game where they thought they could exploit that, and they did, in fair play to them. But I do think that's a concern. That I don't like seeing it, but obviously the set pieces have become more and more effective, and I don't think Newcastle have been anywhere near as effective as they should have been at both ends.
I think the biggest concern is that, and obviously we've both had 3 weeks off, but you could quite easily once again remove any reference to Everton, and you could be talking about any game in the last kind of 3 or 4 months, but obviously a couple here or there, where it is these individual errors.
Yeah.
It is men being allowed to roam freely into the box, whether they're going unchallenged or whether they're being poorly marked. And it's so frustrating. And the players have to take responsibility. The leaders on the pitch have to make sure that they're getting into to their teammates if they're not doing the job. But also I think maybe it's about going back to basics, and you can work on all these lovely routines, both defensively and offensively, but actually get back to basics and sit Tonali down in front of a TV screen and say, look, you've done this on 5-6 occasions. I don't actually think that's an exaggeration for how many times it's happened this season, and say, just follow your man, be stronger, show a bit more desire, because it is costing Newcastle United. And also what is costing Newcastle United, Sean, is Nick Pope. Great servant, great shot stopper, but we're going over old ground. Newcastle United need to spend big in the summer for a new goalkeeper, because once again, an error has cost the Magpies. Dwight McNeil fires from the box. I actually don't think he should get that much space to get that shot off. I think it's poor. I think there's too many players running for the ball. It feels like there's a real desperation to leave their mark from a Newcastle point of view, and that's actually resulting in them losing their discipline and organisation. Because if you watch that goal, Dwight McNeil actually has the ball, he passes it, and then no one's kept on him, and the players have just gone straight towards the ball. Tonali's one of them. Dwight McNeil's taken a touch, he's got the shot off. That's not good enough. That being said, it's a team effort. Pope should do better. He doesn't. Falls to Beto. I mean, what are we going to go on a massive rant here, or are we just going to say tomorrow's Tuesday?
I find it sad, to be honest, because I think that Nick Pope's been absolutely brilliant for Newcastle. If the impact he had in that season when they come in and finished fourth, he was unbelievable that season. And I think what I've always defended Nick Pope with is there's always been no one can say that he's good with his feet. He just isn't. He looks very uncomfortable when the ball's at his feet. And a lot of the modern way of playing is having a goalkeeper who can sort of be progressive and start attacks and be that sort of playmaker, quarterback at the back. Now, not every goalkeeper is Edison, but some goalkeepers are better at it than others, and Nick Pope clearly is one of the worst at it. But also, the defence of Nick Pope is that in terms of the fundamentals of goalkeeping, coming out and claiming crosses, being commanding in the area and making unbelievable saves, he's always done that for 3 years. This season, for whatever reason, it hasn't happened. He started really well. I think it's easy to forget that he had 5 clean sheets in 7 matches at the start of the season. And then it sort of fell off a cliff in the autumn time, where he made those 3 away games against West Ham, Brentford and Marseille, where he made 3 calamitous errors, and he got an injury then, and that sort of took the decision out of Eddie Howe's hands to play Aaron Ramsdale. The problem for Newcastle is, and I don't think I'm out of turn saying this, Aaron Ramsdale then come in and was worse. If Aaron Ramsdale had come in and performed and looked calm and assured, Nick Pope wouldn't be playing for Newcastle now. He'd be on the bench, and Aaron Ramsdale would have made the position his own. The fact is, he didn't. Pope come back in, had an impact. I don't think anyone would argue with that. He played well against Burnley. He was in goal for the Leeds win, the Palace win, where Newcastle looked to have turned a corner. But then the mistakes have started creeping back in again. I thought against Karabakh, there's a couple of goals he should have done better with. Didn't cost him, because obviously Newcastle won the game quite handsomely. There's probably more errors I can think of, but the one at the weekend I was so disappointed with, because it was, as you say, it was such a team effort, and in real time I almost thought like he dived too early, and he kind of like went past the direction of the ball, which is why he then pushed it infield. If you watch the replay, that wasn't the case at all. Almost he got caught in 2 minds whether to catch it, parry it. In the end, did neither. And what should have been a routine save ended up with Everton retaking the lead, and it was the timing of it again, as I mentioned before. The fact that Newcastle had just equalised, had just made the changes, the crowd was getting back up. They'd been really poor for half an hour, but the fact of the matter is they should have been on top in that moment, and Nick Pope gave them a route back into it. And I think it's quite clear Newcastle need a goalkeeper in the summer. Whether or not Pope stays and remains number 2, which I think will happen, remains to be seen. Aaron Ramsdale, I'd be very surprised if Newcastle turn that into a permanent deal. They've got to find a goalkeeper who is obviously good at the fundamentals of keeping the ball at the net, but can also be that sort of progressive goalkeeper to start the attacks. And I think that I'm not professing to know someone of that ilk, but if you look at how successful Sunderland and Man United have been in terms of plucking unknown goalkeepers from obscurity, and Robin Roofs for Sunderland and Sammy Lamons for Man United, they've both been so assured and brilliant and very, very young, with the best years ahead of them. And I think that could be the route Newcastle go down. But they've got to get it right at the end of the day, because, as we've said, Pope's cost them some points this season. Ramsdale's cost them points this season. The foundation of a good team is laid on a good goalkeeper. And if Newcastle don't get that decision right, it's just going to be accentuating it probably even further.
Have you seen much of Blackadeemos on loan?
I haven't, but I've obviously been keeping an eye on it and done a few sort of loan watches and stuff, and he's very, very popular in Seville. What I would say is that he was in Newcastle for a full year and couldn't get a look in. He had that 45 minutes against Wimbledon, and that was it. So the likelihood of him coming back to Newcastle, regardless of how good he's been in Sevilla, is very slim. I think the mind's already been made up on him. Be interesting to see what happens with him, though, because by all accounts, I don't think Sevilla have the money to buy him, or certainly pay the wages that he's on at Newcastle. We all know why that transfer happened. It was really an accountant transfer to make sure they didn't breach PSR and Obviously, he came as part of the Elliot Anderson deal, which we'll not labour on too much about because we know how much that frustrates everyone. The long short of it is Vlad Dios isn't the answer. I think he's already proven that, and hopefully Newcastle can get a decent fee in from him in the summer off the back of a decent loan spell at Seville.
Is James Trafford the answer? Because it's funny, haven't gone off for the last 3 weeks. Suddenly, James Trafford, I think people are starting to rewrite history, because when Newcastle United were really in for him in the summer before he went to City, there was a lot of questions from fans, and it really split the fan base. It was definitely not, I wouldn't even say 50-50, to be honest. I think more people were in favour of him not coming to Newcastle United.
Yeah.
But over the last few weeks, he's suddenly gone from someone who might be able to do it, although you look at what he did at Burnley in the Premier League, it didn't happen for him. Suddenly to this, he is the answer in the eyes of quite a few people. I'm not totally convinced. I think there was a good goalkeeper there, but my opinion from what happened, in that season in the Premier League with Burnley, obviously had a great season in the Championship. My opinion on him hasn't really changed. Is that there is a player there, but is he good enough to be number one at Newcastle United in the Premier League? I'm not too sure.
I'm just sort of laughing at myself because I had quite a heated discussion with a friend earlier in the season about this, who is a big fan of Trafford, and I was sort of like vehemently like, is he an upgrade on Nick Pope? And at the time, I argued he wasn't, because, as you just said there, the only evidence we had to base off James Trafford in the Premier League. Now, undoubtedly, his ceiling is absolutely huge, and if his potential is realised, he will be one of the best goalkeepers in the country, no doubt about it. But the risk was on Newcastle bringing him to be in a number one, when the only evidence we'd seen of James Trafford in the Premier League was at Burnley, where he really, really struggled. Granted, in a struggling team, but really struggled, and was replaced by Muric, the substitute goalkeeper, who was just as bad, if not even worse. But at the time, Vincent Kompany decided that he had to take Trafford out of the firing line. He started all right at Man City, found himself in a very unfortunate situation where he's obviously been promised one thing, and then Gianluigi Donnarumma has become available, and a completely different scenario is played out.
Just going to jump in there. How old is that keeper, by the way?
Well, yeah, he's like, 26, 27? I think everyone forgets that he was AC Milan's number one when he was 16, but obviously, when he was 16, he looked 26, so brilliant goalkeeper, by the way. But I think the problem with that is that we've seen Trafford play for Man City, do quite well, actually, and I think you're starting to see that he probably will become the goalkeeper we all thought he might do. The risk was for Newcastle was we hadn't seen the evidence that he definitely would do that.
But do you think, I don't know how many games he's played this season, 4 or 5, he'll probably play on Saturday in the FA Cup against Newcastle as well. Is that enough for him to be the number one Newcastle United need next season, or are we still kind of betting on his potential? I mean, look, if you're working day in, day out with someone like Donnarumma and Pep Guardiola, then that also helps a little bit. But, if Newcastle United were to splash, I don't know, 40 million on James Trafford in the summer, despite him only playing 12, 13 games at most, would you be happy?
I don't think I would be. That's not to say that James Trafford isn't. I think James Trafford has proven at Man City that he will become the goalkeeper we think he will. He will become the goalkeeper that many thought he would do. I think he's got unbelievable potential. The problem for Newcastle now is they obviously agreed a fee of £27 million in the summer. Man City had the rights to match it, and we all know what happened, how it played out. There's not a prayer Man City are selling him for less than that. It's going to be more than that. And they would argue that the performances he's put in when he's been given the opportunity has shown that it should be more than that. He's obviously on a big contract at Man City now. And it's whether Newcastle can justify paying that money for someone like James Trafford. And we all know that the Premier League rival, there's going to be a sort of Premier League tax on that as well. I think Newcastle are probably better served parking the Trafford thing and trying to go with someone with a bit more value. I mean, if Trafford comes, I think it'll be a very good signing. I just think financially, where would it leave them in terms of the money that it'll take to prize him away from Man City? And I think that there'll be quite a bit of competition for him. I think, excuse me, Tottenham, for example, Vicario, they could quite easily be in for a keeper of James Trafford's standing. Obviously, if they do get relegated. Chelsea, Robert Sanchez, we saw yesterday, he's nowhere near good enough for a team of their standing. So there's two teams straight away you think would be in the discussion for a James Trafford type. In terms of the body of work, I think Quaveen Kelleher at Brentford's probably proven that you can't be a young number 2 at a big club like that, not necessarily have the consistent body of work in the Premier League, but show enough talent that you can do it consistently. He's went to Brentford and been brilliant. I think Trafford will be good. My concern would be how much it would take to prize him away from Man City, when ideally for Newcastle, they probably would have liked to have got him over the line in the summer when he, not an unknown quantity, because we all know what he did for England under 21s and played brilliantly last year in the Championship of Burnley. The only unknown was how he'd cope with the Premier League. And I guess I've probably contradicted myself again here, because he has played well in games, but he's only played 3 games in the Premier League. And those were the 3 games before he got replaced by Donnarumma. But then I think Newcastle have seen him 3 times at close quarters recently. Or would have seen him 3 times at close quarters recently when he plays against them at the weekend. And in the first 2 games in the Carabao Cup semi-final, he did really, really well. So it's an interesting one. I wouldn't begrudge it at all. I just fear that the money it would take to sign him wouldn't make it out of reach for Newcastle, but would take a large chunk of the transfer budget.
Yeah, especially when you consider what probably has to happen in the summer regarding other positions. I do think they've got to spend big in the summer on a goalkeeper, and you get it right, then you're looking at number 1 for the next 8 to 10 years potentially. And Trafford could be that, but still maybe a little bit of a risk and a gamble. Let us know in the comments your thoughts on James Trafford. We mentioned there Murphy getting the equaliser and Newcastle United, should it then bottle that and go on to hopefully win the game, but they just don't. You got Gordon losing the ball, Barry ends up bundling it in really embarrassing circumstances. I think it's Lewis Hall who kind of bundles him to the floor, and it kind of hits him and goes in. Really, really poor, frustrating, just like the goal that they conceded as well after equalising, shocking defending. Why can't they hold on to a lead?
I'm searching for answers on that, and I think I have been all season. I think we spoke on the podcast before the turn of the year when they went on that run of games where they just kept conceding late goals and how much it cost them. Now, this wasn't a stoppage time goal, but I mean, they shot themselves in the foot twice. When it happened in the first half, you think, right, surely that's not going to happen again. In the second, Everton's third goal, but the second time it happened in the game for Newcastle, conceding a minute after scoring the equaliser, you felt it just like rip the energy out of the stadium. It's like, how many times have we seen this? And again, it comes down to individual errors, and I don't think it's a question. Is it a question of mentality? Perhaps, because surely at that point you're thinking, right, don't do anything stupid. Keep it tight at the back. The momentum's going to be with us. The crowd's going to be with us. We go from there, and because it's happened so many times, it may be a mentality thing. But I feel like the mentality thing is just like an easy sort of cheap word that's thrown out there just to sort of give it a title to what's happening, when actually, like, it's just individuals losing the concentration or doing something stupid, and it's costing them time and time and time again. And I don't think I'm speaking out of turn to say that. I don't think Everton were that good on Saturday, yet they've come away from St James's Park for winning 3 goals, and their away form this season's been absolutely outstanding. I think since David Moyes has taken over, the second in terms of the most away points they've taken, which is an unbelievable record. But I almost feel like that it was easy. They didn't really earn the win. Don't think Newcastle laid much of a glove on them, and until that Tonali effort in stoppage time, which again, Jordan Pickford, he gets his critics when he comes to St James's Park, and he's the former Sunderland player that everyone loves to hate, but there was almost like a sort of reluctant appreciation of how good that save was. And I think that almost accentuated the need for a good goalkeeper, because at the end of the day, the goalkeepers in isolation proved to be a massive difference on Saturday, because he saved Everton 2 points and Pope's effectively lost Newcastle a point, if not 3.
I mean, you'd have him, wouldn't you? Someone of his ability.
Of course you would, but it's never, ever going to happen, is it? Like, there's too much water under the bridge, I think, and too much sort of history between the two parties. But of course, I mean, he's England's number 1 for a reason, and I don't think any English goalkeeper has come close to it in that time. And as I say, Pope's been really, really good across a sustained period, but this season it's cost them, and Pickford, I think, is just another level.
2 quick fire questions then to finish off, and you guys watching this, and do please get in touch on social media and get into the comments and answer these questions alongside Sean. Firstly, Fortress St James's Park. it is no more at this moment, right?
No, and I don't think anyone can argue with that. I think, I can't remember what game it was after, but I wrote a piece along those lines where the fear factor has just gone. Like, it just isn't there anymore. I think post takeover for 2 or 3 years, the atmosphere in the stadium was ferocious. I remember being at the end of Eddie Howe's first, not his first full season, but when he took them from relegation zone to 11th. They played Arsenal the last game of that season at home, and the atmosphere was unbelievable in that game. It was like a bear pit. And remember the Everton game that season where it was a relegation 6-point atmosphere was unbelievable that night. It probably brought home to me the difference in the atmosphere. And this isn't a dig at the fans, by the way, before it gets taken that way. But I think there's a lot of game fatigue in terms of there's so many games now that the atmosphere just can't be at that level every time because fans are just there constantly and they're not being given good performances on a consistent basis to get behind. Whereas that is what they've been given over the last 3 years, where it's ferocious, it's intense, and the energy in the stands is matched by the energy in the pitch. And I think the energy in the pitch this season just hasn't been there. That showed in the stands, because you look at the atmosphere for the Barcelona game at the start of the season, unbelievable atmosphere. The Liverpool game, unbelievable atmosphere. But then it got to the Man City semi-final, and I think that was the fourth home game in a space of like 10 days. And if you compare that to the Arsenal semi-final the year before, where Newcastle were firing, the stadium was firing, it's just not there anymore. And I don't think that's on the fault of the fans. I think it comes down to the performances of Newcastle's players haven't been good enough this season to sort of warrant the atmosphere in the stands. But it's just the amount of games. I mean, at the minute now, we're already 2 games into a 5-game run at home. That's just a quirk of the fixture list and being across many competitions. But as a fortress, it just isn't. They've lost 3 in a row in the Premier League now. I think it's the first time they've done that since Steve Bruce was in charge. It's definitely the first time. Well, it is because it's the first time anyhow that's happened. The away form we know hasn't been good enough across the season, and they sort of relied on the home form to sort of bail them out of it. That's not happening anymore. And I think the away form as well, as a byproduct, is almost putting the pressure on the home performances. And the players have mentioned it a few times, and they were aware at the weekend that it was a home game against a team in and around them in the table. Jacob Murphy mentioned that in the programme notes. Eddie Howe mentioned it in the press conference, and it just didn't happen. And they're running out of opportunities now, as we mentioned before. It's like we keep saying 4 points from 4th, and it just keeps getting lower and lower and lower. And it's come to a head now where 10 games to go. I genuinely feel that if they get beat on Wednesday, depending on other results, all of a sudden Europe as a whole next season just looks a real bleak prospect, given that the next game is Chelsea away, and obviously then after that it's the big one against Sunderland at home.
Well, that was going to be the final question that I was going to ask you, whether the Champions League hopes are done and dusted. Let's say 5th is a Champions League spot as well. Newcastle are currently 12 points off that with 10 games to go. I think you can probably write off Champions League qualification. Then it comes down to 6th, 7th, maybe 8th as well. But even that, they're 4 points from 8th and 9th. Everton and Fulham respectively on 40 points there. Newcastle on 36. What does their European aspirations look like? Or is it let's wait until the full time whistle on Wednesday and then we'll get a clearer picture?
Yeah, I think so. It's not over, but the problem for Newcastle now is they have to be almost perfect and the rivals need to start dropping points. Saturday felt like a big opportunity. If you look at the table, Everton are 40 points now, Newcastle are 36. If Newcastle won the game, they would have been on 39. Obviously, Everton would have been on 37. So there would have been 2 points clear of Everton. I think they still would have been below Fulham on 40 points in 8th, but it's 1 point rather than 4. And all of a sudden you look it up, you're still sort of in touch with Brentford in 7th. Now the 7 points off Brentford, and that's the fear, because Newcastle need to string a run of results together and rely on other teams messing up. And the problem as well is that obviously Newcastle have the FA Cup and the Champions League sort of to contend with as well, whereas Brentford and Everton, particularly Fulham, just don't. I mean, Brentford and Fulham are still the FA Cup, to be fair, but the Champions League is obviously a big sort of money spinner for Newcastle, and it's one of those where realistically, are Newcastle going to win the Champions League? Probably not. They could go on a run and they could open up and we can dare to dream, but they've got to get past the best team in Spain first. So let's not get ahead of ourselves, because I mean, if they do, it does open up and they've got a chance to get in the semi-finals, because you're back against either Atletico Madrid or Tottenham. But it's not a case of Man United and Tottenham sort of tossing off the Premier League last season to concentrate on the Europa League, knowing that by winning that you win a trophy and get in the Champions League. I don't think Newcastle can do that, because the Champions League is just so hard to win. And I don't think anyone, even with Newcastle full throttle, expect them to win the Champions League. So I think that has to be the priority, just because of the money involved in terms of the summer and all the money they generate from the Champions League. Each win's so important, cresting each round so important, and it's sort of take it from there. The best chance may come in the FA Cup. If they get beat on Wednesday, then the FA Cup becomes the avenue. Then if you win that, you get into the Europa League, just like Crystal Palace did last season. So it's bizarre, because if you look at the league table, because of how Newcastle and other teams performed in Europe, it's going to be a case where 8 teams get in Europe again. And it means 5th getting the Champions League, 7th gets the Europa League, 8th gets in the Conference League, barring a team outside of those places winning the FA Cup like last season with Crystal Palace. You're probably looking at the most teams ever to qualify for Europe via Premier League places, and possibly the lowest points tally to do so. And Newcastle, if they don't get that together, are going to be absolutely nowhere near it. And that's probably the biggest indictment, I would say, of how poor the season's been, that the fact that they're nowhere near it. And it basically boils down to Wednesday. If they win on Wednesday, and we know how much good feeling that'll sort of produce beating Man United at St James's Park. It always does. The season almost takes on a positive spin again. If they lose, to me, depending on what the results are, they're going to have to go to Chelsea and win then, which their record at Stamford Bridge is absolutely dire. So you're not backing them to do that. To me, the Premier League season is over and you almost become a cup team then, and that then piles the pressure on the FA Cup and the Champions League.
Yeah, well, let us know in the comments your thoughts on whether you think Newcastle United's hopes for European qualification next season are hanging by a thread. I'll just sign off because I did promise some pals I would read out their quotes on how Saturday went. One sent in a ton of swear words, so I can't do that. These two, I think, probably sum it up quite nicely. Looks like I'm missing out having a nap then. And the other one was, now I was pleased I was watching Mamma Mia in the theatre. Would you rather have been in the theatre while doing that, Sean, than seeing them getting beat off Everton?
I'm not a fan of Mamma Mia, so no. But I mean, yeah, there was a bit of me, and obviously we mentioned at the start that we've been off for a few weeks, and the Everton game was my first day back, and there was a bit of me watching the game on Saturday, thinking I wish I just extended that leave till Monday and made this my first day back. But yeah, pretty tough times. But on the positive, they're still in the FA Cup, they're still in the Champions League. The Premier League position is retrievable, but time's running out. They've got 10 games and it's got to start on Wednesday.
Certainly so. We're bringing you the match preview with John Gibson, looking ahead to that game with Manchester United, as well as a view from the opposition as well. Remember to take advantage of your discounted offers on your Saily and NordVPN applications. Thank you for tuning in. Do get into the comments. Do get in touch on social media. And for me and Sean, we'll see you guys very soon.